Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 9th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 10th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to take in this week's podcast, and I'm excited that we are in this growth season. I know I keep coming back to that, but it's exciting to be able to be in a spot where we can continue to grow, be in a spot where we continue to learn, be in a spot where we get our faith challenged, and acknowledging that, and then working within that. One other thing that I want to kind of throw out, I know that we are quickly approaching episode 400 of the Faith and Science podcast, and I want to put out something for everyone is if you have any questions or something that you've always wondered with, or how do you put out a podcast week after week for nearly 8 years now, I would love to answer some of those questions, can give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, and I'm going to throw out one quiz question and see if anyone's ever noticed. With some of the music, there is something that I do in particular every single week, and it's been something I've been meaning to say for years now, but I just have never said it. What is that? Does anybody know what I do with the music every single week? There's something in particular that I do. So I'm just curious if anyone has ever noticed that, or if anyone's ever noticed that, or if it's something that it just kind of falls into the background. So I'd like to kind of acknowledge that. I will also say there is something that's quickly approaching in the pipeline. I know I've teased it before. I'm not quite ready to announce it quite yet, but it's something very different than anything I've ever done in the 400 episodes that I've done. And so I'm really excited about it. A couple things that I want to just touch up a little bit, and I'll probably have a special episode kind of announcing when it's going to be dropped, and then have like a special drop on when that is. It'll be probably, I'm kind of leaning toward a Tuesday release date on something like that. So I'm really excited about it. I'm leaving you a little bit in the dark on purpose, but I think it's something that's going to be hopefully really beneficial and something that is a bit of a different type of conversation than we've had before. And I think it's something that I'm hoping that you enjoy, and I'd love to hear your feedback on. So let's just jump into the question that we had for last week is, how are you going to give from your abundance instead of hoard? And I think that's a difficult question. I think it's something that is important to think about and to contemplate, but it's not necessarily the easiest thing to go through. And I had a great response here where one of our loyal listeners bringing back Malachi 3:10. God promises us for stewardship, and I think this also includes time and energy. There's an old saying, if you want something done, ask a busy person. It seems to me we do whatever someone else needs to be done, and we always find time for ourselves as well. And then goes into an example on how when he worked in the Coast Guard and opening up the bar, which was access to the sea, there was one of these ships that was struggling, and all these ships are going out, and it's the oldest ship that's struggling is the one that goes to help person in need. And I think it's one of these moments where acknowledging that, looking for that, and seeing that, and it's spending time with that is really important. And I think especially within the world in which we're moving into, I think that type of person becomes more and more valuable. And I think it's something that as a human society, we need to get back toward. People like helpers. And I think there's a lot of times that it's easy for us to forget that. So let's just jump into it. One of the Old Testament texts that you can get into this week is from Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1, and verses 10 through 20. The first one is kind of setting the time period, and we're about 700 BC. But it's this idea of how, yet again, the people of Israel have abandoned God. Surprise, surprise. And how God is tired of how this relationship is kind of going back and forth, and this recognition on, do you not recognize the things that I'm giving you? Do you not recognize all these gifts? And instead, you're focused on the burnt offerings and the practice and the sacrifice that way, and more looking at it as something to do instead of the full repentance of it. And one of the examples that they kind of get into here, coming out of verse 17, of how they are ignoring the widow, they're not defending the orphan, they're consumed with the self, to the point that they are not being able to utilize the gifts that God has given them because they're so consumed with self. And in doing that, that also disobeys who God has created us to be and causes us to get consumed with the self and forget God, part of that. So there's lament that we're almost getting here of the prophet Isaiah giving what God is going through with this. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 50, verses 1 to 8 and 22 through 23. And this is recognizing that our God is a God who is active. It is a God who does not remain silent. It's a God who tries to judge our people rightfully and does a great job at it, way better than I would ever do, does it perfectly. But it's also the recognition that we need to be able to hear that and recognize that and testify to that and recognize that then we are trying to draw closer to God and not tear apart. Be of something that we can give thanksgiving for, and it's something that God can honor and recognize in that. The other Old Testament text this week is from Genesis chapter 15, the first 6 verses of it. This is a fairly familiar Old Testament text, and this is where Abraham is still known as Abram at this point, is having a conversation with God and recognizing, I don't have an heir. The only heir that I have is with my slave. And the Lord comes back with him and says, no, that's not going to be who your heir is, and instructs him to go out and count the stars. And that's how great your descendants are going to be. It's much greater than what you are recognizing. This is much bigger than what you can imagine. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 33, verses 12 to 22. And this is then recognizing that we are in this heritage. This recognition that all who are inhabiting the earth are part of this family. It's the question of whether or not they're going to follow. And in doing that there is the victory that the Lord has by us accepting the steadfast love that God has for us. And that our soul yearns for that and looks for that and recognizes that with that, the Lord is our help and our shield and is able to guide us and give us the steadfast love if we're willing to accept it. The epistle text this week is from Hebrews chapter 11, the first 3 verses, and then 8 through 16. This is then kind of referencing back to the faith of Abraham and obeying the calls of what God has told him and recognizing the inheritance, which is then the Genesis 15 text. But also recognizing that there were multiple things that Abraham did in recognizing that God is in charge, God is telling me to do something, and even though it doesn't necessarily make sense, specifically like with Isaac and trying to potentially sacrifice him, this recognition on how God continued to provide. Sarah is too old to procreate and have a child. God overcomes that. This idea of how following God, recognizing that God has given you gifts, whether you recognize it or not, and in doing that, then follow through with that, no matter how crazy or weird it seems, that in doing that, that's obeying what God has called us into, and don't be ashamed of it. Recognize that this is something that is God-given to steer you forward. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 12, verses 32 to 40. And we get this nice little reassurance here from God. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you your kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief can come and no moth destroy. But then it kind of shifts a little bit, and this is where we get the text of being ready, recognizing that the master can come from the banquet hall at any time and knocks, and making sure that you are prepared for that. Recognizing that that might come at night, that might come at dawn, but recognize that the Father and Jesus is coming through in an hour that you may not expect, coming from verse 40, but this recognizing of how God works in ways that aren't necessarily what you would expect, and to be prepared for it, because the hour of when God is calling upon you is going to be at the most unexpected. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, ways to be thinking about these texts week after week. And I just highly recommend checking that resource out. It's an amazing resource, again, to help you prepare for worship, thinking about it from some great biblical scholars. Additionally, if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but they also have great art, prayers, hymns, colors, and daily devotions. Remember, if we are spending this amount of time week after week listening and preparing, it makes sense that you're going through this. Maybe go through some of the daily devotions. Maybe go through some of the art. It makes a lot of sense. And especially in this growing season, it can be really helpful to think about and contemplate, and how are other people thinking about and looking at these texts artistically, through music. How are people creating daily devotions for it? I think it's an amazing resource. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I highly recommend that also. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that includes the weekly reflections, going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, along with a lot of different ecological events and ways to be thinking about it from an ecological lens. If you enjoy listening to my podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy this resource. So make sure that you check out the first link down in the show notes to cover the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. How do we be prepared? How do we be prepared? And I think especially coming from a scientific lens, that's something that is worth thinking about. When you are planning and thinking about doing some type of scientific research or looking into something, there are these moments that we have to think through the null hypothesis, and we've talked about that before, but also thinking through, like, what are things that I'm going to need? What are things that potentially could happen? And trying to think through a lot of those different types of scenarios. I know this last summer, and this is a little bit of an aside, but if you know who Ryan Trahan is on YouTube, I know this last summer he did 50 states in 50 days, going to different Airbnbs all over the country. It was a really great series my wife and I really enjoyed watching. But one of the things that Ryan did, and he's talked about in different interviews, is preparing for it, where he did a lot of his thumbnails ahead of time, thinking through some of the different possibilities. There was this kind of challenge wheel that potentially could sabotage how they were getting to the next Airbnb, and trying to plan and pre-plan how am I going to handle these different potential obstacles that could come my way with that. And so I think that is something as people we're accustomed to, but I don't always think we think about it in that way. And sometimes in a faith perspective, we don't think about that way. But I also think there's an aspect to it that we have to recognize is the gifts that God gives us is something that is an active process where God is continuing to prepare us to use those gifts. Being able to take what we have naturally been able to accomplish, or naturally things that are easier to us, and being able to prepare us for a specific time and moment to come into action. And I think there is no better representation of that than Wilbur and Orville Wright, the Wright brothers, the people who are credited with the first manned-powered flight. And let me explain. Wilbur was the third child in his family. Well, his brother Orville was the sixth of seven, and got married and were born to a really interesting family. Their father was a bishop and was traveling around the Ohio, Indiana area throughout their lifetime. Their mother, rare for the time, had attended college, and she was extremely mechanically inclined, which meant she was designing toys and fixing things, especially with her husband being out on the road. And as a child, there's plenty of discussion talking about how great their childhood was in a lot of ways. And one of the things that is a highlight, with their dad being on the road and often gone, being the church bishop, he ended up bringing back this helicopter toy. It was essentially like a propeller on top with a stick, and then it had a rubber band that would kind of wind up to be able to propel it into the air. And this was something that fascinated the boys, to the point where they tried, even in their childhood, recreating it, not super successfully, but again, like their mother, had taken after a little bit of the mechanically inclined nature and got into a couple different businesses, looking into entrepreneurship with starting kind of a newspaper, magazine, more newspaper at the time, but really falling into, in the early 1890s, 1892, having a bicycle shop. Now, this was huge at the time because the safety bicycle had come out, which is what we would call a bike now, that the tires were the same size, and it was taking America by storm. It was an absolute craze. And so with that, they opened up this bicycle repair shop. And one of the things at that time is the bicycle shop would be busy really from about springtime to fall, which meant that there was a good section of the year where it really didn't make sense for them to be sitting in the bicycle shop. So this allowed them to be a little bit more creative. In 1896, there was a person who had been working with the early aspects of flight. Now, you have to recognize that this has been an infatuation of people for centuries. And in the late 1800s, we were thinking we were getting kind of close. We were getting into doing a lot of gliders and things of that nature, but the aspect that we were really struggling with was still control. And this was kind of epitomized by one of the people who had been working the most on gliders, Otto Lilienthal, who ended up dying in 1896 because one of his gliders got taken out of control. And this was something that the Wright brothers had kind of been loosely following. But when this happened, this was one of the things where it's like, hey, we have some time. Maybe we can look into this a little bit further. And so this was something that then inspired them to look into and grow a little bit with trying to figure some of this stuff out. Now, at the same time, we have the Smithsonian Institute was obviously working on it and had government contracts looking at trying to figure out how to have a manned-powered flight. Essentially, having something that is going to propel a human through the air that's heavier than air and being able to carry a human. Now, this is something, again, that they had been working on. We had had unmanned flight by this point, but we hadn't had manned flight. And one of the things that is fascinating to me, and I think it also is something within our own human nature we need to reflect on a little bit, was a lot of people were trying this and putting engines into planes, recognizing they were still too heavy, but I'll just try it. I'm just going to force it. I'm going to really just go hard, and maybe I'm misunderstanding things, which then led to a lot of accidents, a lot of failures, and a lot of money being spent in places where this then just wasn't successful. One of the biggest competition that the Wright brothers ended up having was coming from Samuel Langley, who was getting support from the federal government and had gotten $50,000. And by the time the Wright brothers had gotten to their plane, they had spent about $1,000, which again still is a lot of money, specifically as we are turning into the early 1900s here. But the amount of cash they couldn't keep up with at all. But Langley just kept trying and had this kind of catapult system, and it just wasn't successful. What the Wright brothers decided was, with hearing how a lot of these different gliders were having issues, was control. Specifically, if there was some type of wind gust that came up, that they were at the mercy of the wind and they weren't able to control it. And especially within how they were flying, they had to be able to control the X, the Y-axis, and the Z-axis. And so the Wright brothers started working on figuring out having a cable system, but essentially also getting a belt system to be able to control the rudder and being able to control the X, Y, and Z axis. This is at the same time as plenty of others. Langley, they kept thinking, was right on the edge of this, that he was going to do this, especially that he was the most known scientist. The federal government was supporting him. They were figuring this was just a done deal. It was a matter of time. The problem that he was overlooking was he was never looking into the wings and how the dynamics worked. Meanwhile, for 5 years, basically, the Wright brothers kept going to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to try to figure out how to make lift. They figured out that Lichtenthal, who had left some equations for lift, they figured out in 1901 that they were wrong. And they had to figure out how they are going to make their own equations to get it closer to what it actually is. It meant them designing their own wind tunnel to be able to look at the wings and being able to figure out how the air was moving over them to create lift, which led to December 17th, 1903. When they finally were at Kitty Hawk and got a manned flight in. And in fact, they ended up having multiple flights that day. They did have the wind at one point, did catch them, and it ended up destroying the Wright Flyer, the original Wright Flyer. Which then, in 1904, they came back and made the Wright Flyer 2, which was able to go longer distances, and eventually even getting into the Wright Flyer 3 in 1905. Now, the Smithsonian Institute got into a little bit of a quarrel with them and took them decades to be able to acknowledge that the Wright brothers had actually beat their own scientists in being able to do this. But the Wright brothers now are often credited as the ones who were able to figure this marvel out. Yes, they had a lot of gifts that were naturally given to them. In the aspect of having a mechanically inclined mother. A mother who was able to inspire science and math and encouraged her kids to pursue these different activities. Having a mother who was inclined even with having a college education and not being disappointed when neither of her sons ended up graduating from high school for various reasons. Having a father who lovingly gave them this toy that was such an inspiration to them, and their faith ended up playing a factor within their whole story as well. In fact, one of the days where they had a perfect day for trying to take off in one of their tests with Kitty Hawk, they didn't do it because it was a Sunday, and it was very important to them to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, which to them meant not doing anything. The Wright brothers had the background, but then also spent the time perfecting the craft. They never expected to be the ones to be able to figure out manned flight. They were ones who thought that maybe I can end up developing a paper or something of that nature to help in the understanding of wing design or lift or being able to help in that process. They were never expecting that they were going to be the ones to beat out a federally backed scientist who was very, very well known at the time. Their lamps were lit. They were prepared. They went through the processes of figuring out how they were going to be ready when that time came. And as it approached closer and closer, they were hearing that Langolier was getting closer and closer and realizing how close they really were. They did it. Now, granted, they had some help. Having a bicycle shop was helpful. They had their own engineer being able to make a small engine, and it was at that point that they dropped it into the original Wright Flyer. But they did that after they had prepared everything else. That they were confident in their glider to the aspect where now we are ready for having a motor to be able to propel us. I think this is something that we have to acknowledge and think about. We even see it in the Genesis text where Abram is confused on who is going to be my heir. How is this all going to work? How are I going to be part of the chosen generation for all this? And recognizing where God's like, I know what's going on. I have gifts set up. Trust me with these gifts. Isaiah getting into the aspect of the people aren't trusting. They're saying things and not doing them, and thus God isn't able to work. They're seeing it as a process. They're seeing it as just a ceremony, walking through these steps. They're not acknowledging it with their hearts to be able where I'm able to stir within them to acknowledge the gifts that I have given them. And Hebrews reminding us of all these times where God continued to provide. And in doing that, when the time is right, when you don't expect it, God shows up and is able to provide. God has gifted you and prepared you for those moments that your lamp is lit and you are ready. But it means that you have to keep working your craft. You have to keep acknowledging and working on and figuring out, what do I need to change? What do I need to do? Where is God in all of this? What is God steering me toward next? It's one of the hard parts of life. It's easy for us to acknowledge now the Wright brothers on this side of it. But there were years where they didn't know what was going on. They were from very humble backgrounds. They were the complete underdogs. And after this happened, gets referenced by the federal government, ended up helping to design planes, ended up having to fight for keeping all their different patents, but it totally changed their lives. They were prepared for the moment. They had worked their craft. They didn't get discouraged. They figured it out. And I just think about it now where it's like wind tunnels are used consistently now for testing things, and look who helped figure some of that stuff out. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you need to be persistent with your gifts? Where do you need to be persistent with your gifts? I think when we look at a global scale with a lot of the different things that are going on, it is hard to keep awake, alert. It's hard not to feel discouraged. It's hard to feel overwhelmed. It's hard not to feel like Abram and say, what are you talking about, God? It's easy for us to walk away and then have like Isaiah complaining and saying, what are you guys doing? We know that that's not the way that God has called us into. God has called us to continue to be faithful and to trust even when we don't necessarily see the light and don't necessarily understand what's coming next. And that's sometimes the hardest part of faith. Recognizing that God's on the other side and God's in control and we just don't see the picture yet. But it's coming together. And if you talk to any elder within their lives, there's definitely times where they knew that there was things that they were walking through that they didn't understand. And at those moments, that's when they figured, when they can look back and, oh my, God's been building me for this. God's been working with me on this aspect for months, years, decades. To prepare for this. I think that's something that we have to remember. That God has a plan. God knows what's coming. God understands what each of us is gifted with doing and has a master plan of how it's all going to come together. And sometimes we have to have faith and trust. But it doesn't mean just sitting back and saying, I have faith and trust and I'm not going to do anything. It means sometimes also recognizing that means we have a role as well. And within that role, then we have to keep working that craft to get prepared for our moment. The Wright brothers spent many years of their life, whether they realized it or not, preparing for a moment. And it changed history. And I think in the world in which we're in, we're on the edge of having huge history moments happening. And I know God's going to be showing up in all of them. It's a question of if we're willing and able to acknowledge it, and we're able to see it within our own lives as well. And that's exciting. So keep on working your craft. Be alert. Be awake. Don't let it be stolen from you. Let God continue to work with you. so when the moment's right, you're ready for form. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.